Welcome to the Pro Wrestling Diagnosis number 1. I've been wanting to get back into talking about pro wrestling on the channel, and so here I am. It's hard for me to talk about pro wrestling months at a time because it's hard for me to watch wrestling weeks at a time, but I'm going to try my best going forward to not take such long breaks talking about pro wrestling on the channel. And we are going to start the wrestling diagnosis. Diagnosis in the name because I feel like pro wrestling is dying. I felt this way for a long time. Despite there being so much pro wrestling on TV, yada yada yada. It's all the same. It all blends together. Nothing really stands out. And I think that is a problem. So tonight I'm going to try and break down some of the past week in pro wrestling. We're going to talk about mostly the WWE and AEW. I tried to watch some of the other things here and there, but nothing really stood out. I will give my AEW Revolution pay-per-view analysis towards the end of this video, this audio video, for any of you that are here to hear that. But I'm going to start with the WWE as we are on the road to Wrestlemania. The build to Wrestlemania has not been good, in my opinion. They're really building up the main match between Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar, title versus title, I guess as a unification. I don't know if they plan on sticking with that since they love their brand split between SmackDown and Raw. But that has been the only match with any kind of good build, in my opinion. Now, let's first talk about the rumors of the return of Stone Cold Steve Austin, who has not wrestled in nearly 20 years. But Dave Meltzer threw out this rumor that Kevin Owens talking shit about Texas was going to lead to the return of Stone Cold to a real match with Stone Cold, and yet we are only weeks away from WrestleMania. And of course that hasn't happened because Dave Meltzer is usually wrong about these things. It's funny though, because when that report went out, it went mainstream that Stone Cold was returning for a real match, and maybe it still happens. But even one of my friends who has not watched wrestling literally in 20 years. In 2 decades, he has not watched wrestling, any wrestling, since 2002 when the pro wrestling boom came to an end. He texted me asking if Stone Cold was really returning. And I was talking to him about how I doubt it was going to happen, because why would Stone Cold return after all of these years if his neck injury would have allowed him to wrestle any time in the past decade or more? Why now is he returning? Would it truly just be for the money? I mean, yeah. In the end, this is business. And I can see Stone Cold returning for a match or two if the money is that high. But is the money really that high? I don't know. And now as we've moved along closer to WrestleMania, it just doesn't seem like Stone Cold returning for a straight up match is going to happen. I can see him returning for to stun Kevin Owens, and maybe Kevin Owens, since WrestleMania takes place in Texas, which I forgot to mention, but I'm sure anybody listening to this should already know that because I assume you're a wrestling fan. So it could just end up being Kevin Owens getting attacked by a bunch of Texas legends at WrestleMania, because right now the build seems to be Kevin Owens and Seth Rollins as a tag team challenging the tag team champions Alpha Academy to the titles. I guess there's still a little bit of time that maybe somehow this turns into a match with Stone Cold, but at this point, is Stone Cold coming back after all of these years just because Kevin Owens is insulting Texas? This is the storyline that brings Stone Cold Steve Austin back for a real match. Put himself out there for a potential injury for a real match. doubtful. Even some of his best friends in the business, like DDP, said they doubt it's going to happen, but they could just be kayfabing, and maybe he really returns for a real match, but I don't know. I have a hard time seeing it happening. But if it does, I'll be there glued to the TV, because Stone Cold is still one of the best characters in the history of this business of pro wrestling. And anybody that's seen any of the wrestling videos that I've done on this channel, it's been a while, I know, but they would know that I mostly care about characters and storylines. And my favorite matches and what I consider the best matches are the matches that tell stories. Elsewhere on Raw, we also have the Bianca Belair and Becky Lynch feud. And one of the last wrestling videos I recorded after SummerSlam, which means it's been quite a while since I talked about wrestling, but for good reason, because it's been mostly unwatchable like usual. I talked about them basically with Becky beating Bianca so quickly at SummerSlam, how it just kills all of Bianca's build, and how this trend with the WWE doing this to their black wrestlers who become champions and then lose the titles and then kind of disappear or go way down on the card like Big E just a while back, a few weeks ago, was awful. And they could, I guess, right a wrong here with this feud if Bianca comes out on top of WrestleMania. But I'm not 100% convinced that this is what they're going to do, because this is the WWE we're talking about, and them going with the logical solution and the logical road to go down isn't always what they do. So I wouldn't be surprised if Becky Lynch wins this match at WrestleMania, basically undoing any form of good storytelling that they could be doing, building back Bianca, and Bianca getting her win over Becky to make Bianca the face of the women's division, which she is now going to have to be, because we'll get to Ronda Rousey in a while. But overall, the women's division isn't strong right now in the WWE. It's not quite as weak as in AEW, but AEW is at least making... They made a lot of strides in the women's division. When AEW first started, in the first year of AEW, I didn't watch a lot of it, but I saw how weak the women's division was. And over the past year and a half, watching some wrestling again, the AEW's women's division is still weak, but they've made progress. But I do feel like within the WWE and their women's division, it's kind of all over the place. And they do a lot of the same thing they do with the men and just smother any progress some of these women can make. So Bianca going over Becky at WrestleMania continues to push Bianca as a hot face in the company, and I believe that she is that. So that's the direction they should go in. Will they actually do that? Who knows? I still will never get how companies like the WWE and even AEW for that matter, or certain soap operas, insults the black audience, even though that is bad for business. It has been well known for decades that the black audience will buy. So I don't understand it whatsoever from the WWE, and why they just did a similar thing to Big E this year. But he lost the title and then he goes right back relegated to low on the card in tag matches. It just doesn't make any sense. Same thing they did with Kofi. Same thing they almost did with Bianca. They almost killed all her momentum. They did for a while. They've taken the right direction, though, surprisingly, to build her back up and keep this feud with Becky going now for WrestleMania, which is actually, shockingly, long-term storytelling from this company, which does not happen often. We'll move on to The Miz, who's going to be tagging up with Logan Paul at WrestleMania to take on the Mysterios. The Miz can sell any feud on the mic, honestly. He, during this week of wrestling, had probably the best promos. And he had the Mysterios face Cedric Alexander and Shelton Benjamin, who actually defeated the Mysterios in that match. Logan Paul coming aboard to WWE. He's been having these super fights in boxing. See, actually, I'm getting Logan Paul mixed up with his brother Jake Paul. So it shows you how much I care about the Paul brothers. So maybe this isn't the greatest idea, because I'm not that old, shit. But I do think this maybe still appeals to Gen Z and their sometimes bad taste. Bad taste. RK Bro lost to the Street Profits, which is kind of weird since RK Bro's in a tag team title match this coming Monday, but I don't really know where that's going, and I don't know if I care. Now let's talk about the last two segments from Raw, which was 2 different heel turns in a row, which was kind of a strange formatting issue. Some of these formats on these wrestling shows these days are so weird. I don't understand it. Like, sometimes I really do think pro wrestling has lost the total ability for any sort of storytelling. But we'll talk about it. First, there was a U.S. title defense where Damian Priest was defending his title against Finn Balor. And Finn Balor got the shock win to become the new champion. And so after the match, that's when Damian Priest goes buck wild on Finn, putting him through a table with a razor's edge, really giving this savage turn for Damian Priest, saying that the fans never got behind him, but the fans kind of willed Finn to this win. But then in the very next segment, we get a heel turn by Edge, which I think kind of just crapped all over what was otherwise, I mean, it was basic from the Damian Priest, just putting Finn through a table. But I think he did a good job. He did a good job being the pissy guy that just lost his title. But then when you have Edge, who makes an open challenge for WrestleMania, and AJ Styles is the one that accepts, but then Edge beats down AJ and gives him not 1, but 2 concertos. I just feel like it made the Damian Priest and Finn Balor stuff matter less. But I mean, I still enjoyed Edge's heel turn, who's done a good job as a face, honestly, with his comeback tour. And now he gets to be a heel, which is, frankly, when Edge was at his best in his prime as a singles wrestler. And I think an Edge versus AJ Styles match, who also AJ just recently turned face, I think this was set up well. So I will give them credit for a setup for this match to WrestleMania. And before we move to SmackDown, let's talk about that Vince McMahon interview on the Pat McAfee show. I had never really tuned in too much to the Pat McAfee show, so I was surprised by how good it was, honestly. I think he's possibly the most entertaining person in any sports shows. I've always enjoyed Dan Patrick, even though I haven't watched him in forever, but his show used to be entertaining as a sports show with Dan and the Danettes. But Pat McAfee is definitely a modern, entertaining yet knowledgeable sports show. So I saw a lot of clips from that leading up to this interview with Vince, and I thought the interview was great. And then I went back and watched Pat's interview with Brock Lesnar. Pat gets the best out of people in interviews. He has a talent for that. So it should be no surprise that he got a really interesting, great interview with Vince McMahon, almost kind of humanizing the billionaire Vince McMahon in a way. So I enjoyed their interview. It wasn't quite as entertaining as the Brock interview, but it was still a good interview. And now it will set up Pat having a match at WrestleMania that will be with Austin Theory, who has basically been Vince McMahon's failure goon. I feel like they could do a better job building up Austin Theory. Years ago, I discovered Austin Theory on YouTube, and he has been wrestling since he was a teenager. To get into this business and come this far is pretty cool to see. They could do a better job of building him up, though. But him having a match at WrestleMania with Pat is actually huge, and it will do good for Austin Theory to get some like mainstream attention, because Pat has a lot of mainstream attention. And Pat is just one of those individuals that has it. Like a lot of MMA fighters over the past 2 decades had it when it came to interviews and just engaging people. And I saw that just in that little segment on SmackDown where Austin Theory comes out and says he's the one who is going to be fighting Pat at WrestleMania, and basically tries to intimidate Pat and then slaps the headset off of him. And then Pat gets on the table and starts yelling at him. It just came off real. Pat does a good job of acting and getting into character. And he's a good talker. So it fits. I actually think that Pat will be entertaining at WrestleMania in this match with Austin Theory. A couple of other things. We had an Intercontinental title match on SmackDown with Sami Zayn losing the title to Ricochet. This is probably an unpopular decision with the marks, but never been a fan of Ricochet. He has this really kind of cool, fast-paced style, but it's usually sloppy, and he's terrible in promos. Ricochet is one of the worst on the mic I've ever seen. But, you know, Ricochet winning the Intercontinental title was surprising, so that was cool. And this feud between Johnny Knoxville and Sami Zayn, yet again, another celebrity. There's a lot of celebrity matches at this WrestleMania, probably because the WWE continues to fire a third of their roster, it seems like. So they need celebrities. They need money for the celebrities for WrestleMania, I guess. But Sami Zayn as a heel is very entertaining. Years back when he was a face, I used to think Sami was so boring and just such a basic wrestler. But him as a heel has been entertaining. One of my favorite heels over the past year, honestly. So I like this feud between him and Johnny Knoxville. Also, because Johnny Knoxville will take bumps too. So it makes for an interesting dynamic. Now, one match that I give zero cares about is Baron Corbin and this Happy Corbin gimmick. I have not watched a lot of Baron Corbin's anything over the past 6 months. So this Happy Corbin gimmick is stupid. This is really the first time I paid attention to it, and I think it's stupid. And I think his feud with McIntyre, I don't care at all. Also on SmackDown, we had a pretty great match between the Usos and the Viking Raiders. I will try to talk about later. And then we had Ronda Rousey getting a win at the end of the show. The Ronda Rousey-Charlotte Flair feud is not working. I think Ronda just comes back to play the same character she was playing before, where she just basically defeats the whole roster. She's just super face, but eventually during that run, everybody will stop giving a shit about her. If that hasn't already happened. Might have already happened. Misha Tate was a better character on Celebrity Big Brother than Ronda Rousey is in the WWE. That's just facts. Just facts. But yeah, I don't really care about this feud, to be honest. It's going where it's going to go, which is Ronda defeating Charlotte at WrestleMania probably, which is another reason why I'm worried that Bianca will lose to Becky and it will be a terrible decision. Because right now, it seems like a lot of faces could be winning at WrestleMania. But let me get off of WWE and focus on AEW. Going to talk a little bit about Dynamite and Rampage before giving a preview to AEW's pay-per-view happening tomorrow night. Revolution 2022 will be happening. But let's talk about Dynamite for a minute. Well, first, actually, let's talk about Tony Khan buying Ring of Honor. I mean, let me get this part out of the way first. Tony Khan on a microphone should just never be a thing. This should never happen. He is one of the most awkward humans that there is, first of all. So putting him on a microphone is just so awkward. He's so awkward on a microphone. It is rough to watch. It's cringy. He's cringe. He is the definition of cringe. But he announced that he bought ROH at the beginning of Dynamite in a cringy manner. And I guess it's interesting that ROH can live on this way. I don't know if it's like going to be a developmental territory for AEW. I don't know what that means for Dark and Dark Elevation, because that's kind of what the YouTube show is. And I honestly feel like at this point in time, AEW's YouTube shows are probably more popular than ROH's anyway. So this name, having the ROH name is interesting. It also makes me wonder if Cody Rhodes is really gone from the company. There's been a lot of speculation on where Cody Rhodes will end up. Will he end up back in the WWE? Who knows? It'd be odd, because Cody Rhodes went to AEW just shitting all over the WWE. So I don't know if the WWE really cares to bring Cody Rhodes back. So it would make more sense if him being gone from AEW is actually a storyline with ROH. Because Cody, before AEW, was being built up again in ROH. So I could see like Cody comes in to run ROH, eventually leading to some sort of ROH and AEW feud or storyline. I think would be great. But of course, I'm always thinking about storyline first, and I don't know if the wrestling business actually does that anymore, especially Tony Khan. I think what maybe matters more to Tony Khan is buying that Ring of Honor library, because they have the Honor Club, which is cool, but they don't have all of those first 10 years of Ring of Honor, which are the only 10 years of Ring of Honor that I care about, because those were good years. There was a lot of good stuff in those years. The early days of Ring of Honor I enjoyed. So I hope that makes the first 10 years of Ring of Honor become more available to view online, even though Honor Club has a lot of the first 6 years, I think. But anyway, let's get back to Dynamite. After that, we kind of had this throwback to Ring of Honor between Bryan Danielson and Christopher Daniels. Two ROH originals had a match. But the best part for me was that after Bryan Danielson wins, he does this thing where he says he's going to shake Christopher Daniels' hands, which is kind of a nod to Ring of Honor. But then he just stomps away on Christopher Daniels because he says, "Now I'm in AEW." Really just proving to me just how good Bryan Danielson is compared to almost anybody else in wrestling. And it's honestly something I have to shockingly give Vince McMahon credit for, because when Bryan Danielson first came into the WWE as Daniel Bryan, and I knew him from ROH, and I liked him in ROH, he came up in that NXT shit, and this was before NXT was like a reality show and not a wrestling show. And it was cringy at times. And then he got fired with that whole tie incident because he was choking the announcer with a tie and whatever. I always felt like they never really got him. And then the whole Yes movement kind of took off, and I was at the Wrestlemania in Miami when he lost the title in like 28 seconds. And the Yes chant just disappointed everybody, and then the Yes movement came from that. And he finally became a star, and then after he wins the title... let me go back, actually. I'm forgetting the biggest part of the point I'm trying to make. He's in that tag team with Kane, and it's kind of a joke. But it really developed his character, and I think it really gave Bryan Danielson the knowledge of how characters work in wrestling and how to be an entertaining character for one, but also how to like engage the audience. So I just always felt like at the time Team Hell No felt too much of a joke, but I genuinely believe that is what has made Bryan Danielson the best overall person in pro wrestling, because he is the total package. He has the in-ring ability, clearly, and he has the character ability down too, and this was a great example of that. Even though it was a small thing, it was a great example of that, in my opinion. And I also think maybe him almost ending his career because of concussions, hopefully that's in his mind too, to not go over the top in the ring and get more concussions, because that would just be bad for him personally, and I don't want to see that. I'm not Dave Meltzer, who anytime a wrestler almost kills himself in a match is like, well, the match was great though. No. But we'll move on to him feuding with Moxley, and Moxley is someone who kind of gets on my nerves. Not at all in a good way. Moxley... Here's my problem with Jon Moxley. And look, it's great he got clean and he's sober, and I appreciate that for him personally. But as a wrestler, I have a problem with him because when he left the WWE, he did all of this bitching and moaning about Vince McMahon and about how nobody understood his character in the WWE and all of his ideas were shot down. But right now in AEW, he is that same Dean Ambrose that he was in the WWE for the last 2 years in the business. He is cutting these promos that don't make any sense, and he's just supposed to be this crazy, hardcore wrestling man. But it's not working for me. His promos make no sense, and yeah. So I've enjoyed the build for this storyline, but it is Bryan Danielson carrying this storyline on his back. And the fact that they're just two ex-WWE guys kind of makes AEW look suspicious. That they just keep hiring all these ex-WWE guys and failed to build a lot of stars of their own, which we'll get to with their world champion. But yeah, it annoys me that for all of the bitching Moxley did when he left the WWE, he's basically the same character now in AEW that he was in WWE. That, frankly, wasn't working. Next on Dynamite, we had the Casino Battle Royal tag match. It was way too long, and I gave 0 fucks about the match. Young Bucks won, which was even worse. We didn't get a lot of it on this show, but in the past few weeks, I have enjoyed the build to Jericho and Eddie Kingston, but we'll get to that during my preview for the pay-per-view. And then we had Punk and MJF, which it was a mixed bag for me, because first of all, the very last video I recorded on Pro Wrestling was about CM Punk coming to AEW and how this is how they can start to keep momentum as a wrestling show and a wrestling company. And they totally dropped the ball with CM Punk because they have made CM Punk just another wrestler over these past 6 months. And I think a lot of that has to do with Punk, who is like just happy to be back in wrestling and happy to be working for a company. But like, it's weird. I don't understand Punk's state of mind with that. He's lost a lot of the creative things that made him interesting for a long time. But with MJF, last week they did a weird thing with MJF where they did the whole MJF is mean because he was bullied by anti-Semitic people in school, which is great and all, but they just made CM Punk look dumb for falling for that after all of the shit MJF has done as a heel in AEW. For it to just take 1 week for CM Punk to think he could have a breakthrough with MJF didn't work. And I think this is a case of AEW failing with telling stories. Like, maybe if they had stretched this out longer, maybe it works, maybe not even then, because I still think it just doesn't work. Because either way, CM Punk's going to look dumb in the story that he just takes one sob story from MJF and just believes that MJF is just a hurt person trying to hurt people. So yeah, I think Punk falling for that made Punk look dumb. And then Punk gets beat up afterwards and gets busted open and gets hung by the dog collar by Spears. I don't know. I feel like they messed up with this feud over the past 2 weeks. Like, MJF is great on the mic. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed him last week on the mic when he was giving a sob story. He did an excellent job at it. But I don't really know if that fit for this feud without making Punk look dumb. And I don't know how much I like dog collar matches either. So I wish the match of the pay-per-view wasn't a dog collar match, because I could probably only name one dog collar match ever that I found good, and that was like in the early to mid 80s with Piper. So the segment, like, it was on one hand kind of good. I mean, it was awkward when Punk was cutting his promo in the ring and the crowd was just quiet. Like, it seemed like the crowd didn't care, and I think the crowd didn't care because they knew that Punk was just going to look dumb if he believed MJF's sob story for 1 week. Keith Lee's in AEW now. He was interrupted by Team Taz. I don't really know if I have enough to say about that. To tie into MJF and Punk, we've been having Wardlow having problems with MJF and Shawn Spears. I do wonder if that will play into the dog collar match at Revolution. We'll have to see. Lastly on Dynamite is Adam Cole and Hangman Page. I don't even want to get too much into this yet. I want to save it for the preview, but by God, have they failed to get Hangman Page over as champion. Like, of all of the main matches being built up for Revolution, the title match has had one of the worst builds. And in fact, you could even say that about the women's title match too. I don't know what it is about AEW, but it seems like Tony Khan does not put in effort into actually building his title matches, which is weird for a guy that thinks having a system where pro wrestlers have fucking records to try and make their records matter, but you can't even make your main titles matter. It's a problem. It's just a problem. But I want to get more into this here in a while when I actually preview the pay-per-view. But the Dark Order also sucks. Just want to keep that in mind. We'll talk about Rampage for a second. I mean, not enough really happened. Eric Redbeard debuted, a.k.a. Eric Rowan. He'll be in one of the matches at the pay-per-view. But then we had the TNA title match on Rampage, which was this really hard-fought title match. And I have to say, I really enjoy Sammy Guevara in the ring, and even sometimes on the mic. He puts on a show when it comes to matches, and while his pace and matches with too many high spots are not my favorite thing, and this match had a little too many high spots for me to call it an epic match, but I still enjoyed the match for this kind of style. And I think a lot of that is Sammy Guevara, but also Andrade as well. Andrade has been putting on some really interesting matchups lately in AEW. So that's a match to check out, but I will get more to that. I'm going to do a whole best match of the week thing. But let's actually preview AEW Revolution, which will be taking place Sunday night. We'll start with some of the pre-show matches, even though I don't have a lot to say about them. But we have Layla Hirsch versus Chris Statlander. Yeah, I don't know. I just think they've actually put effort into building Chris Statlander, so I just think she should win here. But they did something weirdly weird in this feud where they had Statlander mention that Layla's parents gave her up, which I feel like that's a very heel thing to bring up, even though Layla's kind of acting like the heel in that match. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I mean, it's a pre-show match. I don't have a lot to say about it. Another pre-show match, I think, is Hook versus QT Marshall. I mean, it should be a win for Hook. They've been trying to make Hook like Taz, obviously. I don't know if it actually works because Hook is about 100 pounds. But he's over with a certain segment of the AEW fan base. So, I mean, why not put Hook over someone like QT Marshall, who usually has a good record? I guess that's the best thing I could say for QT Marshall, even though I don't care about AEW. Their records, I don't care about them. And then we have House of Black, which is Malachi Black, Brody King, and Buddy Matthews versus Death Triangle, which is Pac and Penta. And now they have Eric Redbeard. This has been kind of the characters segment of AEW that maybe is in dire need of someone like Bray Wyatt to come aboard and maybe make this a little more entertaining, because they all just kind of come across like cartoon characters, but I don't care about any of them, unfortunately. So I don't know if this match has some good build, but I think it's a pre-show match anyway. So yeah, we also have a Face of the Revolution ladder match. It's been kind of interesting to see how hard these wrestlers have to qualify for a ladder match, only to then get a shot at the TNT title rather than the AEW title. That the AEW title is in need of a spark because Hangman Page isn't working. Once again, I have to reiterate that. So I do think it's weird that they all had to try so hard to get into this match, which is a match to then earn a shot at the TNT title. But then on the other hand, I think that like Sammy Guevara is actually doing a really good job building up the TNT title. So I don't hate it. I just hope that anybody other than Orange Cassidy wins this match. Orange Cassidy needs to be nowhere near any of the top titles. He is a one-note gimmick that doesn't work for me, and I think anybody else in this match would be a better number one contender for Sammy. I think the favorite to win is probably Wardlow, but Wardlow also seems on the verge of a face turn and a storyline where he doesn't need to be number one contender for this title. I think it's more interesting if somebody like Hobbs or Ricky Starks win this match. But it's a ladder match, and there's like three powerhouse people and three wrestlers who you would normally see in a ladder match. But I'm assuming Wardlow's the heavy favorite to win. We also have the TBS Championship, Jade Cargill champion versus Ty Conti. Jade has done great. Jade is one of the best things in AEW, whether marks like it or not, because they say she's green in the ring. She brings a character to the division, the women's division AEW, that is much needed. And Jade, because she's undefeated and because she's that bitch, makes the TBS Championship matter a whole lot more than the AEW's Women's Championship seems to matter. Like, the build for this match hasn't been great, though. It's a new title, and there's just no reason for Jade to lose to Ty. So hopefully it's just an interesting match. I think she needs to win, keep her strong, keep the title actually meaning something. That's really all I'll say about that match. I think Jade should be the winner. And we might as well talk about the AEW Women's Championship next, which is Britt Baker versus Thunder Rosa. Look, in my opinion, Britt Baker's title run never had momentum. And it certainly, even if it had a little bit at the start, it has certainly died out by now. I like to think that this is where Britt loses the title and Thunder Rosa takes the title and brings something new to this title because it needs it. The Women's Championship in AEW needs something new, and I think Thunder Rosa could be that something new that is, frankly, just more entertaining than Britt Baker. Britt Baker, she can sometimes talk on the mic, but I just don't think anything has been interesting at all about her title run. I think Thunder Rosa would be just to see what Thunder Rosa could do with it. Just for that alone, I think the title change needs to happen. I just don't know if it will actually happen. But I think it just makes more sense. These two actually have a history too. So I think if they're actually trying to tell a coherent story, then Thunder Rosa should win. Then we have a Tornado Trios match, which I don't even think should be a thing. But it's Sammy Guevara, Darby Allin, and Sting versus Andrade, Matt Hardy, and Isaiah Cassidy. This match does nothing for me, and I don't care. That's all I'll say about that one. Now, the Eddie Kingston and Chris Jericho match has been built up well, and I think it's because they both just can cut great promos. Them using Ortiz and Santana as something in their story was also brilliant because Eddie Kingston has a history with those two in Impact Wrestling and other wrestling. So there's a history between Eddie Kingston and them, and then they were obviously in a stable with Chris Jericho. So bringing them into this was the way to go. But I think what makes the story mean more is that Jericho saying that Eddie Kingston can't win the big one. And I think that is the build this match needed to make it more interesting as well. Is can Eddie Kingston win the big one? I think he deserves the win in this match. I don't know if that's the way the company will go. But I think it will bring more, because Chris Jericho, at this rate, even though Chris Jericho isn't chubby anymore and stopped all the partying and got in great shape again, he is still old. He's in his 50s, and I mean, Eddie Kingston is no spring chicken. He's old as well. But I think seeing Eddie get the big win and maybe becoming more of a contender for something else just fits better than Jericho getting the win here. So I would like to see Kingston win and further that build that Eddie Kingston actually wins the big one and can maybe take that in an interesting direction. The AEW tag titles, Jungle Boy and Luchasaurus versus Red Dragon versus the Young Bucks. Look, it's hard for me to be into tag team wrestling. Unless it's like late 80s, early 90s, like when me and Fanguy were doing Who Really Won the Wrestling War, and WCW had their tag division was more entertaining than their singles division, and a lot of that had to do with their singles division at the time just being garbage. But they had strong tag teams at that point. So right now, any of these tag teams in any of these companies, just hard for me to care. And anybody that has watched or listened to any of my wrestling videos would know I don't like the Young Bucks. I think they are a joke, and they don't entertain me at all. So I am not looking forward to this match, for one, just because they're in it. But I also don't know if I care about Jungle Boy and Luchasaurus as tag team champions. And frankly, I don't even care about Red Dragon. So I have no interest in this match. I'm assuming the champions retaining make the most sense, because Jungle Boy, they pushed Jungle Boy a lot last year, so they should at least keep him a champion of something, even if it's just a tag team. Now, I talked a lot about this already, but we have Jon Moxley versus Bryan Danielson. I've enjoyed the build despite my lack of interest in Moxley. I think Bryan Danielson needs to win this match because at some point in the near future, Bryan Danielson needs to be AEW World Champion. Whether AEW Originals like it or not, it would elevate that title where it needs to be, because Omega did not elevate that title where it needed to be. And I'll talk a bit more about that with this main event here. But if Bryan Danielson loses this match, I mean, I don't think it hurts him that much. But I don't know what it does for Moxley either. Because Moxley as a character is stale. just like it was in the WWE a few years ago. The dog collar match, CM Punk and MJF. I talked about this a lot as well. It depends on the direction they want to go. If they are building MJF to be the world champion eventually, if he's the one to take out Hangman and become the champion, then maybe MJF should win this match. But I feel like they shouldn't have bloodied Punk and hung him from the dog collar if he wasn't going to win this match. And I think maybe they set in motion that Wardlow could screw MJF, so it's kind of a funky win for Punk, and it keeps MJF kind of safe. But I don't know what it does for Punk to be bloodied on Dynamite and then also lose this match. Because like I stated earlier, Punk has struggled in AEW. I just don't know if him losing this match helps that problem at all. I think Punk has to bloody MJF in this match, and I think has to win unless it is a funky win for MJF, which is always possible. I don't know. This could go either way. I don't think it helps or hurts either of them, especially since this is a gimmick match. It's a dog collar match. It just really depends on the direction Tony Khan is going, and if he actually has any plans to elevate his title that he's failed to do, his world championship, and who the successor to Hangman Page is. I think it needs to be Bryan Danielson. But Punk or MJF are possibilities as well. But like I said, the setup for this match needs a payoff, and the payoff is usually something that should be Punk bloodying MJF and getting the win. Now the main event, and I use main event in quotation marks because Hangman Adam Page versus Adam Cole for the World Championship. Both of these guys should not be in the main event. It's a joke that this is the main event when so many other feuds have been built up better for one, and the stars in the other matches just overshadow these two because the build for this wasn't good. And Adam Page as champion isn't working. You know, like Tony Khan got a lot of credit for the long-term storytelling of the build to Hangman Page being the one to defeat Kenny Omega. And it should have worked in theory. But I'm going to break down the reasons why it didn't. For one, Omega's title reign was not the epic title reign that they wanted it to be, and that AEW fanboys may have pretended it was. The fact that Kenny Omega was just winning all these championships and was unbeatable. On paper, it should have worked because you're building up this guy as being unbeatable. But the problem lies that Omega is not as good on the mic as his fans want us to believe, and the dirt sheets like Meltzer have wanted us to believe for years that Omega is just the best in the world, when he is just not. Because his mic skills are lackluster, and the character he plays is also kind of a joke, even though it should have been more serious if he is just badass winning all the titles. So for one, with Omega's mic work being subpar, and then you add on Hangman Page, built up to be the successor, to be the man that finally defeats Omega, but his mic skills are equally as subpar. This is why AEW is in this predicament where Hangman Page is being completely overshadowed by several bigger stars because he is not main event caliber at this point. So they did the long-term story, and I mean, yes, maybe there should be props for actually finishing a long-term story in pro wrestling. But the fact is, it just didn't work. And then they align Hangman Page with the Dark Order, who is a joke of a faction that doesn't help anyone attached to it. He's lost. Hangman Page isn't working as a world champion because he does not have... The biggest factor is he does not have the star power that a lot of these wrestlers, most of which came from the WWE to AEW, have. Hangman doesn't have that, and frankly, Adam Cole doesn't either. He might be this great wrestler to the really hardcore fans, but I don't think Adam Cole is over either. And he's only been in AEW for a minute as well. So him getting this title shot doesn't even make a lot of sense in general. So both of these guys being in the main event it's frankly a joke, and it doesn't work. The build sucks. Hangman needs to win at this point. This is his first title defense on a major pay-per-view. So he has to beat Adam Cole. And maybe it could be a great match. I have my doubts because the story isn't there anyway. But Hangman does need to win this match, but I just don't think it's going to help him in the scheme of things. Hangman's probably going to be champion for most of this year, even though it's not going to work. Khan likes his champions to be champions for fairly long term, but Hangman's might have to be shorter, and it needs to be Bryan Danielson, because it would actually raise the AEW World Title to where it needs to be, because it has fallen off going from Omega to Hangman, when it already fell off going from Jericho to Omega, despite what the AEW hardcore fans want to think. I'm just coming at you from a purely unbiased point of view. Alright, lastly, I'm just going to talk about some of my best of the week. We are going to begin with the best promo of the week. I don't know if there was a great promo from anybody, honestly, this past week. So I just think the best mic work was The Miz. Miz on the mic is just always constantly entertaining. And so I'm going to give The Miz the best promo work of the week. Not necessarily the best promo, but the best promo work of the week will go to The Miz. The best segment of the week, I mean, I feel like it would be popular to say that CM Punk getting bloodied by MGF was great, but it made Punk look dumb, like I talked about earlier in this podcast. And I just think it was booked poorly to bloody Punk before the pay-per-view, unless Punk's going to get that revenge bloodying MJF. So my segment is really only a half a segment. The best segment to me was the little thing I talked about earlier with Bryan Danielson giving a nod to Ring of Honor, saying he's going to shake Christopher Daniels' hand, but then stomps on him and says he's not in Ring of Honor. He's in AEW. I think, like I talked about earlier, Bryan Danielson just understands what it means to be a character and to sell that character to the audience to make them care. And I think that little wink, wink, nudge, nudge to Ring of Honor worked, and it just made his heel character that much better than it already is. My match of the week, I got two to mention. I talked about it for a second, but I think the match, if you go and watch any matches from this past week, go back and watch them. The Usos versus the Viking Raiders on SmackDown. It was a short little 10-minute match, but you know, matches for me, I only enjoyed them if A, the build is good, or B, the story, the match tells a story. And there was not a lot of either of those for this past week. But there were two matches that sucked me in to at least care about him for a while. And one of those was this match. There was a lot of near falls that were believable, that the War Raiders were actually going to be the Usos for the titles. And it was just a hard-hitting match. And I think it's a short, quick, enjoyable match to go back and watch for anybody that didn't watch SmackDown. And then that match on Rampage I talked about for the TNT title. It's not my cup of tea always when there are just a bunch of high spots in a match. But the pace was awesome. And Andrade was awesome being this heel character within that match. So Sammy Guevara, Andrade, and Darby Allin on Rampage was also a good match. So those are my two matches you should go back and watch this past week. The feud of the week, I'm going to have to give that to... Man, this is tough because I don't think any of the feuds this past week were just that awesome. So even though it just started, I'm going to have to give it to Edge and AJ Styles. Edge's heel turn coming shortly after AJ Styles' face turn. It just works. It's a match I want to see because this never happened. And Edge going heel is always great because he always makes for a great heel. He gave AJ 2 concertos. It works even though it just started. So my feud of the week is actually going to go to those two, with MJF and Punk being a close second. But it's just been frustrating what AEW has done with Punk. And what they have done is make Punk they've killed Punk's possible star power, and now they have him looking dumb, falling for MJF's poorly planned plot that he's gonna have 1 week of a sob story and Punk's gonna believe him. Come on now. My woman wrestler of the week, also a hard one. I'm going to give it to Bianca Belair. I think she is the face of women's wrestling right now, or at least she should be. And I do like that they make her whipping her hair on Becky look cool. And they made like tore Becky's abdomen up, her smacking Becky with her ponytail. So I'm going to give it to Bianca this past week. No other women really had the huge moment. I mean, I guess Ronda Rousey, but And lastly, my male wrestler of the week will have to go to... I mean, I've talked him up a lot in this video. It can't go to anyone other than Bryan Danielson. Just the whole package in pro wrestling. He understands... For me, it's just so important that he understands what it is to be a great character in pro wrestling. He understands the nuances, the little things, and the fact that he's also awesome in the ring, of course. He's been my favorite wrestler in wrestling for a while now. I just have to give it to him. So the wrestler of the week will be Bryan Danielson, who is just a notch above everybody else in pro wrestling. Roman Reigns is up there. We have to give Roman Reigns his credit, his due, for the great work, the great character work he has done as this heel, as the head of the table. But Roman didn't do shit this past week, so I can't give it to him. So it goes to Bryan Danielson for my first ever podcast, being the Wrestling Diagnosis. My first ever wrestler of the week will go to Bryan Danielson. Thank you for joining me. This was longer than I intended. I knew it was going to be long, but this was even longer than I intended. So thank you for listening.